Hello, AP World historians. Fantastic to see you here. This is your AP World History teacher, Ben Osborne. We are talking today about Unit 3 in general, and specifically Unit 3.1, which is Empires Expanding. So, before we get into the specifics of 3.1, let's talk a little bit about what this 3 point or this Unit 3 really is all about. Okay? So, first off, we're moving to a different time period. So, Unit 1, Unit 2 are in the 1200 to 1450 time period. So, all that stuff about Indian Ocean trade networks, all that stuff, while that stuff is still kind of going on, that stuff is really more confined to Unit 1, not to, time period 1, not time period 2. So, time period 2 then is 1450 to 1750. And we'll have two units here. We're going to have Unit 3 and Unit 4. Unit 3 is about land-based groups, and Unit 4 is really kind of more about ocean going and like European conquest and exploration. Okay, so those are our two big kind of divisions here, but we'll talk a little bit about everything kind of within Unit 3 as well. So Unit 3 is really going to be about the empires, specifically the land-based ones, but also a little bit about some of the sea-based. So again, we're going to have two basic kinds of empires in this period. We are going to have land-based, which is what we're primarily talking about here in 3.1 in their expansion, but we also have some sea-based powers like Europe, but those groups are not going to come about till later. So in 1450, for example, our powers are like the Ottomans and other groups like that that are more land-based. The Europeans have some power, but they're pretty weak. But by the end of this period, say 1700 or so, the Europeans have overshadowed these land-based powers because of the importance of sea-based powers. Now, one of the ways that you can teach this section is to just do it by like group, so like here's the Ottomans, and we talk all about it. And then here's the Mughals, and we talk all about it. But the process, the College Board doesn't really love us to do this. They really want these things to be seen kind of holistically, like all together, so like what's going on with the Safavids and the Ottomans at the same time. So instead, and I've taught it both ways, but instead we're going to teach it this way where we're going to do each of these sections. So 3.1, which is what we're talking about today, is about empires expanding. So it's kind of a unit where we're going to introduce some of these empires. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens to them in their initial phase. And then in the future, we're going to talk about sort of how they administered things, their collapse, and also about some of the other things that are kind of going on in between it, okay? But we're primarily talking about a couple of different empires. So on the land-based side, we have the three Muslim gunpowder empires, which are going to be the Mughal, the Ottomans, and the Safavids. We also are going to have two other kind of quasi-gunpowder empires, which is going to be Russia and the Qing dynasty. Also the Ming a little bit, but really the Qing dynasty. And then we are also going to have a few European powers here. So like in, I think it's 3.3, maybe it's 3.2, we'll talk a bit about like things like the Protestant Reformation, which was going on during this time period, because that has to do with administration. Okay, so it can get a little confusing, but just kind of come along and we'll talk about it as we go. All right. So first off, again, this is Unit 3.1, Expansion of Empires. All right, so again, this section is kind of purely about expansion. Details on administration and things is going to come a little bit later. Gunpowder is going to empower certain empires to expand using these strong militaries. So the development of powerful weapons with gunpowder is going to be an important part of the story and the history here. These are not like AK-47s. These are not machine guns or anything like that. These are simple gunpowder weapons. They are tubes that you put stuff down the front of, and then you fire a ball towards other people. They seem incredibly primitive and terrible to us today, but compared to the bows and arrows or the swords and stuff of the time period, they are weapons of devastation. And properly trained and properly organized, they can absolutely turn any sort of combat that does not have them. One thing that's kind of weird here is what exactly qualifies as a gunpowder empire. You will see a wide variety of empires here. So anything from just the Mughal gunpowder empires, so the Safavids, sorry, not the Mughal, just the Muslim gunpowder empires. So for example, the Safavids, the Ottomans, the Mughal. We also can see it expanded, as we'll do here, the Russia and the Qing. I've also seen Japan listed and Vietnam listed as gunpowder empires. So you have to understand this term is not a term of science, it is more a term of art. What I would say, Russia, Qing, Ottoman, Safavids, and Mughal are what we're going to be looking at here. So those are the ones that we should really think about. They're the ones that are most often in the College Board material and information. These land-based empires are going to reach their highest points of power just before European sea power becomes important. So once the Europeans 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Once that happens, then we're going to have a big expansion of Europe. They're going to start sending out ships around the world and conquering. And so by 1600, 1650, 1700, the Europeans will have supplanted these gunpowder empires instead. Here's a great map from Freemanpedia, awesome guy. But this will also include a couple of our land-based empires here. Now they have Cusco over there with the Incas. We will cover that later on, but that could technically be in this time period. But you're going to see there the Ottomans in the red. We have the Safavids. We have the Mughals. We also are going to have the Qing dynasty and Russia. Those are some of our big ones that we're going to be talking about. You could also include Songhai, which is that West African civilization there as well. So the capital at Gao, etc. But because we're talking more about these gunpowder empires, we're going to be talking about these other civilizations a little bit more. And by the way, what the heck is gunpowder, right? Maybe you know, maybe you're a big shooter or something, but essentially you're going to have a mixture here of a couple different things. So you need to have charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur. When you put all these things together then and properly mix them together and you ignite them, they produce a rapidly expanding gas. So if you put something in front of it, like a piece of metal, which would be a bullet, as the expanding gas occurs, it will push that bullet very quickly out of the end of the gun. Now, if you have a weak gun, like if you have a very poor metallurgical cannon or something, you have not made a gun, you have made a bomb, because that's a problem. So early days, we've had gunpowder for a long time, but in the early days, our metallurgy wasn't quite good enough. So early on, gunpowder is used in military terms, at least, as sort of like a confusion kind of thing. Like you blow up some gunpowder and scare some people, or you make it shoot fireworks at people or something like that, right? But once metallurgy, stronger metallurgy comes about, then we end up creating better and better gunpowder weapons over time. One thing about gunpowder, too, that's interesting is that if you mix up these like numbers it just doesn't really do anything. So like if you did like 20% charcoal or something and 70% potassium nitrate, you're just not really going to have anything happen. So you have to get it kind of perfectly right for it to make the most amount of sense. So it definitely has some downsides to it, obviously, but the upsides of just absolutely devastating weaponry is one of the important things that helps out. Let's take a look at our first one here. We got Russia, and we got this beautiful man right up here above me, Ivan the Fourth, or Ivan the Terrible. So one of the things that we look at as a kind of historical question about the Russians is, are Russians more European or more Asian in a sense? So if you think about Europe, if you think about Russia, they're in Europe in a sense, like the Ural Mountains is usually considered to be the blockade there, but they were under the control and the power of the Mongols for a very long period of time. So they didn't have as much connection with them until Ivan comes around. So from their conquest about 1200 or so until 1547, then they are basically under the authority of the Mongols, or subsequent Mongol tribes. So they are kind of cut off and disconnected from the rest of Europe. And also because they expand to the east as well, they can very easily be considered to be an Asian empire as well. And so that is one of the questions that we have. And we'll come back to this later when we talk about people like Peter the Great, etc. So one of the things here is that they are very crucial for trade. They are like the key part of different trade routes. But while they're under the authority of the Mongols, we have a couple people who are going to kind of cast off this, right? So I believe it's Ivan the Third or Ivan the Great who will basically choose not to give fealty to the Mongols for the last time. That will set up then Moscow to become a very powerful city that will sort of unite all these other princes together into what we might call a modern state known as Russia. So Ivan the Terrible, a number of years later, will be crowned in 1547, and he will expand that border to the east into modern-day Siberia, mainly relying on gunpowder. So he will do things like attack and destroy these Mongol successor states that are there, and he will end up kind of like organizing that group. He used what are called Cossacks, or peasant warriors. So what they would do is they would free serfs who had control and authority and send them down to these areas to fight. And so these peasant warriors would fight local tribes and these Siberian Khans, and if they were able to do so, they could get their freedom. And so that was one of the benefits to the serfs that were there. Eventually, the Russians will gain control of this Volga River, which will promote more trade. It's an eastern kind of river. And by 1639, the Russians had gotten as far as the Pacific Ocean. So they become a major power in that time. And by the 1700s or so, they are going to be a major, major power. Now, as you may know, Ivan the Terrible has a well-deserved reputation for being a pretty horrible person, but he also is a very, very strong figure. Unfortunately, when he dies, he does not really have a good successor, and so the whole thing will kind of fall apart again for a while until we have the Romanov kings come in instead. Next up, we got the Qing dynasty. Now, we kind of short shrifted the Ming just a little because last time we talked about China a lot. We talked about the Yuan dynasty, but of course we did talk about Zhonghe and others who are part of the Ming dynasty in time period 1. But it lasts about 300 years. They last from 1368 until the 1600s, basically. And the Ming dynasty will expand China into Mongolia, Central Asia, but eventually they're going to lose control, even though they do things like revamp the Great Wall of China. So they were overpowered by the Manchu from Manchuria. So if you look on this map kind of right above me, you can see it says Manchuria or northeast. So just kind of north and east of where the Mongolians were is this other group. And the Manchus are quite similar in a lot of ways to Mongolians. They are steppe tribes. They are, herding nomads, these kind of groups as well. And so they will invade into China and take over control, defeat the Ming dynasty, and establish a new dynasty called the Qing dynasty in 1644. And this will be the last dynasty of China. It will rule until 1911 when it will be replaced by the nationalists, and then of course the communists, which rule today. A couple of important leaders here for us over time. Emperor Kangxi, who had a very, very long reign, just a really good reign. He expanded into Taiwan, Mongolia, and Tibet, so we'll have a big factor there. And then we have Emperor Qianlong, who expanded west of China, so he's going to move into that Xinjiang region and lead to its annexation. Now, the group of people who live there are called Uyghurs. That's how you pronounce that word. It looks weird. That's as close as I can get. That is, of course, today an issue. So the Uyghurs are in Western China, and they are predominantly Muslims, and so the Chinese government has been cracking down on them in big ways. If you remember that Mulan live-action movie that came out recently, they filmed a little bit of it there, and that caused a lot of controversy because of people's feelings about that. Next up, we got the Ottoman Empire, named after a footstool. No, actually, the footstool is named after them. Modern-day Turkey is where they're going to be based. They will expand into the Balkans in Europe, also into North Africa and Southeast Asia. They have a very big empire, and that's one of their issues, is that their empire kind of is ungainly over time. It's the largest and most enduring of the Islamic empires of the area. I mean, it lasts literally from 1300 until the end of World War I. This is 1918, but they kind of like peter on until 1920 until they're like fully put out of their misery. But I mean, they're around for a very long time, 600 something years in some form or fashion. Early on, they are a dynamic force for conquest. Mehmed II will lay siege to Constantinople in 1453, and he is using this gigantic cannon to knock down the walls and stuff, and he will end up seizing it. That is when they change the name over to Istanbul. And then also under Suleiman I, this is the peak of the Ottoman Empire, and they will get all the way to Vienna, Austria, which they will besiege. So Vienna, Austria could have potentially been under Muslim authority or Muslim rule, which is an interesting historical counterfactual. This good-looking guy right up here is going to be Suleiman I. We know him as sort of the lawgiver, or the Magnificent is one of his names. They tend to call him the lawgiver because they feel like that is a slightly more important thing that he did. Again, here's a nice little map for you. We've already talked about the Ottomans over there on the left. You can see their enormous empire is going to be very difficult to control. The Safavids, who we'll talk about in just a second, are going to be there in the middle. It's modern-day Iran. And then the Mughals will be in modern-day India. And then you can see over there, we got the Qing, Russia, sort of all throughout there. And eventually we'll talk about like France, Spain, England, all those kind of groups. Next up, we got the Safavids. So this is probably the one you have never, ever heard of. They're very important, though they don't last very long. So they are in modern-day Iran. Their origin is in the Safavid order of Sufism. That is a Shia perspective. They were established initially in northern Azerbaijan or Iran, and they had a specific type of Shiism called Twelver Shiism. It doesn't matter what it is for us, but it's just important to understand that it's a very specific version of that. Young Ismail, at 14 or 15, conquered all of Iran. What are y'all doing? You're out there getting your driver's licenses, and this dude's conquering Iran. And he was proclaimed Shah in 1501. This is a land-based military power. They had an emphasis on Shia Islam, and so that's going to cause a lot of like conflict with the Ottoman Empire, which is Sunni, and so that is something that lives on till today. So Iran today is predominantly Shia. Iraq and a lot of other countries around those areas are predominantly Sunni, and so there ends up being hostility between them. So I think in America, we oftentimes think of Islam as being just sort of this unified whole. But if you look at the Middle East right now, there actually are a couple proxy wars going on between Iran and, say, Saudi Arabia, because they disagree on these religious points, and so they end up fighting each other over time. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. That above me right up there is Shah Abbas I, who is one of the most powerful of their emperors. Also a major mustache enthusiast, because that bad boy is impressive. Also a mustache enthusiast, though he looks a little creepier, is this guy right here. This is Akbar, who is one of the big leaders of the Mughal dynasty. As you probably have heard in some other videos or me talking about it, Mughal is related to Mongols. So this guy Babur is a descendant of Tamerlane. So Tamerlane is like this wild warrior, kind of Central Asian, powerful nomad guy. He is not able to create a lasting state in Central Asia, so when he dies, it kind of falls apart. But Babur is like a grandson or great-grandson or something of him, and so he will sort of carry on his sort of legacy there, and will invade into India, and in the process of doing that, then he will found this Mughal dynasty. A couple down the way, his grandson is a guy named Akbar, who is one of the richest, and he runs one of the best governed states in the world. It's really well organized. Overseas trading by Arab traders flourished and will cause the empire to be even bigger. And also, of course, the caste system was still strong, even though it was under Muslim rule. So it's kind of weird how that all works out. But basically, they are going to expand this empire, make it larger than it was before, and make it particularly powerful here in India over time. Okay, so that is sort of how these dynasties expand or start, essentially. The next thing we're going to be looking at is how do these empires maintain that standard. So, for example, in 3.2 and others, we'll be talking about stuff like, you know, the military organization or the administration of these different groups. But this is just sort of our brief introduction of these 5 land-based powers. We also, in some of the future stuff, we'll talk about a few of the Europeans, though we won't get into big numbers with them until we get to kind of Unit 4. But we'll talk a little bit about like France and England and others and sort of the nature of their administration as well. Hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for paying attention. Thanks so much for coming, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye, guys.